Storywork is brought to you in partnership with Slingshot. Slingshot are Australia's creative media experts, and having worked successfully with them for years, I'm thrilled to have them on board.
You're listening to a DM podcast.
Well, hi friends, my name is Matt Jones and welcome to Storywork. Over the past 30 years, I've had an interesting career with some amazing success, but plenty of setbacks too. For example, in my 20s, I was a speechwriter to two future UK Prime Ministers. Emphasis on the word future because they didn't win anything while I was advising them. 5 years later, I was heading up strategy in New York City for the world's largest brand experience agency. And then, in 2013, I got to put everything I had learned about storytelling, persuasion, and brand building into my own business when I accidentally became an entrepreneur and co-founded what would go on to become the world's leading craft gin business, 4 Pillars Gin. Over the past couple of years, I've written a book. I've given hundreds of talks about brand, business, growth, and gin, and I've mentored and advised all kinds of businesses, from startups to unicorns. And I've been thinking a lot. What's the common thread in everything I've done? And what's the stuff we're all going to need more of in this future we're heading into? And I think the answer is story. Thinking in stories, telling stories, defining the stories we want others to tell about us, defining the stories we want ChatGPT to tell about us. In short, I think story really matters. So I wanted to test that theory. I wanted to find out how some of the most successful entrepreneurs, leaders, and builders in Australia have used the power of story to help them grow. What stories have propelled them forward? What stories have held them back? That is what Storywork is all about. But then I thought, I wonder what story ChatGPT would tell about me. And I was chatting with the podcast producers, and we thought, well, the best way to shape that story is just to tell it. So this one-off episode is about giving you the chance to get to know me, to understand more about where my belief in the power of story came from. And as it would be hard and frankly weird to interview myself, I sat down with my old friend Amelia Adams, one of the very best interviewers in the game, and I asked her to put me through my paces. Take a listen. Please welcome Amelia Adams. You've interviewed bad boy actors like Charlie Sheen.
I have.
You've interviewed notorious lawyers like Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, all-time legends like James Cameron. You've covered war zones, insurrections in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And now you get to interview a guy who once launched a Ford Falcon and wrote speeches for Theresa May. So Amelia Adams, welcome to Storywork, and the floor and the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Matt. It is a pleasure to be here. You and I have known each other a very long time, and we're both in the business of storytelling, as you pointed out there. So in 2013, when you co-founded what is now an iconic Australian brand, 4 Pillars Gin, went on to become not just Australia's, I should say, but the world's best gin, an unprecedented 3 years in a row. Business you sold for, $90 million 10 years later.
I think we're calling that a commercial in confidence sum, but you as a journalist can say whatever you like.
I think it's such an extraordinary story and an extraordinary success story. But what fascinates me the most about it is when you go back to the beginning, you really were selling a product, an idea, a lifestyle, if you like, whatever you want to call it, for something that did not yet exist. How did you set about doing that?
Yeah, so what you're getting at there is that 4 Pillars was, to my knowledge, I always make this claim, and I've never done, maybe I should ask ChatGPT to do the due diligence. I believe we were the first gin brand in the world to be launched through crowdfunding.
Yep.
And these days in 2025, people tend to have this sort of slight misunderstanding about what crowdfunding is. There's a lot of action in the world around like crowd equity and people trying to sell shares in their business. But back then, crowdfunding was a very simple thing. Really, it was a fancy term for pre-sales. It was this idea that you could suggest to the world that you were going to make a product that you hadn't yet made, whether it was a film festival or in our case, a gin, and see if that story was compelling enough that people would put some money in the till.
So what was that story? What was, and perhaps still is, the 4 Pillars story? What was your reason, if you like, for existing, but also for succeeding?
The first story we had to figure out was actually, why has no one done this already? I always think that being a startup founder is this strange combination of a little bit of arrogance, a little bit of hubris, like I'm going to launch something into the world. I'm going to create something and people are going to value it. Like you've got to have a little bit of confidence, a bit of ego. Like I do a lot of work these days in the world of startups and mentoring startups. And every time I meet a solo founder, they worry me because I say, look, realistically, if you're a normal human, and most of us are, you have gaps. Go and find some co-founders. So I was really lucky. I didn't even find them. They found me. I was the third co-founder of three. My co-founders, Stu and Cam, I always think of them as they're professional drinkers. I was an amateur drinker. They knew the industry and knew so much more than me about gin, about spirits, about the alcohol market, about business in general. But I had this little bit of knowledge around brand and storytelling and strategy. And then the second story, well, what's going to make us successful? And we realized that was going to be this combination of things. We had to make great gin. That was a non-negotiable. Use the word. We couldn't make another gin. We had to make a better gin. But we also had to figure out how we're going to take advantage of this new sort of operating environment. We were still in the early days of social media, of smartphones. The iPhone was still a relatively recent invention. We were starting to see these little brands growing in social media. And we thought, well, could we use that to create advantage and build relationships with gin drinkers differently?
Well, let's talk about that because, as you say, 2013 was a really interesting time to not just launch, but to scale a business. You've got Instagram taking off. You've got, the influencer advertising. How did you tackle that, or that change in the landscape from perhaps the more traditional and iconic many brands and campaigns that you worked on in the past?
So I got really lucky in that Stu Gregor, my co-founder, had this real passion for and talent for building relationships, engaging the trade, working with bartenders and chefs and bottle shop owners and sommeliers, all that stuff. But then, as to your question, this whole new world was emerging, this world where brands could talk for the first time directly to customers, not by making sort of intrusive 30-second ads that played in the middle of home and away, but instead through social media, through these channels of content and storytelling and influence. So we built that brand as well, a brand where Four Pillars could talk directly to people who are passionate about gin. First, through our crowdfunding campaign, where we sold the first batch of 420 bottles to 307 people who'd never heard of Four Pillars until 2 weeks before, had never tasted the gin. The gin didn't exist, to your point, but we persuaded them through storytelling, poetry, seduction, this sense of, well, this sounds exciting. But then over time and release after release, we started to build this really vibrant, direct community, which gave us so much more room to bring people close to the business through storytelling.
I'm ashamed to admit I have queued up for a cinnamon scroll, and I'm saying half an hour to an hour to queue up, which, realistically tasted exactly the same to the cinnamon scroll that was being sold at the lovely decades-old family bakery 3 doors down in Bondi.
But novelty and hype and social bubbles and...
Had people around the corner for an hour taking photos, and everyone has to have... My niece, who lives in France, the capital of pastry in the world, came to Bondi to try these scrolls she had seen on Instagram. So what is it that can make one brand so much more alluring and therefore viral, commercially successful than another? I mean, where does story come into that?
That's a really huge and fascinating question. And I think there's two different ways to approach that. One is to think about the almost like dangerous FOMO that brands can have when they see success stories like that, when they see what's happening in the lines outside a Loon croissanterie or outside the Cinnamon Scroll joint, or they see the grip that Zoe Foster-Blake at Go-To Skincare has on her community and her fans, and they go, how could we do that? We want some of that. But not every brand is built to do that, is built to be successful in that way. And I think what's really important is to connect your business strategy to your brand strategy and understand what stories do we need other people to tell about us and how do we need them to feel? So at Four Pillars, we were very clear. Like we were, the co-founders were 3 very unglamorous, bald, middle-aged white blokes. We weren't going to triumph because we were these young, funky, cool, sexy things. Like we were 3 people in the middle of our careers, like having a crack at gin. But the gin was really good.
Yeah.
And the commitment to making the gin as good as it could be, from sourcing what we thought was the best gin making equipment in the world, this beautiful first still. We named her Wilma after Cameron's late mum. We named all our stills after our mums. So my mum doesn't drink. She got Eileen, the experimental still. Stu's mum drinks a bit more. So she got Jude, the slightly bigger still. And then the stills kept getting bigger and we ran out of founders' mums. So then we had we named them after sort of long-standing employees' mums, which is a great employee retention policy. It's very hard to quit.
I bet.
When your mum's name's on the still, you can't get that name off. But what we figured out was that the one motivating thing for people about Four Pillars was how well it was made, the craft and the love and the attention to detail that went into making it. So the theory we had was that every story wasn't about hype, wasn't about anything other than just bringing people closer to the making, making them feel like they were in the room while Cameron and Wilma were there making that batch of gin, hand slicing oranges, weighing out Australian lemon myrtle and Tasmanian pepperberry leaf. That sense that if we could bring people closer and closer and closer through storytelling, because remember, storytelling isn't just words.
That's
to
right.
your point, it's imagery, it's photography, it's content, it's film, it's all those things. But for us,
and it's how you can make people feel.
Exactly right. And for us, the feeling we wanted was just that Four Pillars is this labor of love. And what I think all of us need to do, and the only way any of us have got a chance to build the equivalent to your cinnamon scroll hype cue, is to just be absolutely committed to a theory and clarity around the role that story can play for our business. And that role is not going to be the same for every business. My first job was in military intelligence in the UK, which I think was a terrible misstep by the UK government, but nothing seemed to go too wrong while I was sort of having that brief stay in there. I was actually an economist. I trained, my university degree was as an economist. I don't think I was very good at it, as I tend to say in my preamble. But I found it fascinating. I found this read that economics gave you on the world and why does the world work the way it does? Why do we have recessions? Why do some economies grow? Why do we have unemployment? It was a fascinating sort of lens, but I don't think I was very good at it. But I was good enough that I got a job as an economic analyst in military intelligence. And that role got me invited to some really terrifyingly high-powered meetings. And one of the meetings I'd get invited to on almost a weekly basis was called the Current Intelligence Group. And this was a meeting of people drawn from across Whitehorse, all the different UK government departments. So, you've got the Department of Trade and Industry and the Home Office, and the Treasury and the Foreign Office. And we're given a topic. And it's a topic where there is current intelligence, hence the name. It's not a very originally named group.
This is pretty top secret stuff. You were,
look,
in your early 20s?
I think, yeah. I mean, it was top secret stuff. I mean, the fact that this meeting exists is hopefully not top secret. I'm touching wood and hoping by the time this podcast goes live, I'm still a free man. But look, we would be given something that there was some current intelligence on and told you're coming together to write a report, a draft report that ultimately will make its way all the way up to the Prime Minister. And what was really interesting is we're all looking at the same intelligence. We're all looking at the same data. But because we all came from different government departments with a different sense of priority, a different lens on the world, a different sense of what Britain's interests are. If you're at the Treasury, you want the economy to grow. If you're at the Department of Trade and Industry, you want to trade with other countries. If you're at the Home Office, you're worried about national security and defence. If you're in the Foreign Office, you're worried about diplomacy. So we'd all be looking at the same intelligence reports and then debating, well, what story is this telling us? What should the 3 pages that ultimately go to the Prime Minister, what should they say? What's the narrative that comes out of this? So I didn't know at the time that this wrestling with what's the meaning, what's the story, was actually going to become the craft of my career. But I look back now and I'm like, that's exactly what I was doing. And that's what I was becoming good at, far more than the economic analysis, which I ran away from as quickly as I could.
And that's where it was born. But that is really critical, isn't it? Because narrative storytelling, reshaping facts really to fit a certain message, is at the heart of politics, which you so quickly discovered when you went on to become a political advisor for the Tories.
Again, a terrible first hire. I was hired to work for my sins, for the UK Conservative Party, and they were in a bit of a post-election loss meltdown. Political parties that have been in power for a very long time don't tend to take losing very well. The Conservatives have just lost their second election in a row to Tony Blair's Labour government. And what opposition parties tend to diagnose as the problem is policy. We didn't win because we didn't have good enough policies. We didn't have good enough facts. We couldn't do what Henry Fonda does in the film 12 Angry Men. We couldn't kind of thump the table and sort of argue our case against the jury again and again and again until everyone agrees that we're right.
So we must change.
Exactly. Well, and what they failed to recognize was they actually had a brand problem. They were just on the nose. People didn't like them. But anyway, they didn't realize that yet. So they decided that the answer was more and better policy. They were going to establish a policy unit. And I got hired to join this policy unit, which is, again, very bad hire. I wasn't good at economics. I don't think I was very good at policy. And the remit I was given was transport, because it turns out people care a lot about transport. They care about whether their trains are on time and their buses show up and their roads don't have potholes in. So transport.
Well, it's dry and boring unless things go wrong. And then
Correct.
people really care, which is so often the case with political issues, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly right. And so I was there to, in theory, develop transport policies for a future Conservative government. I wasn't very good at that, but I spotted this little opportunity, which was to score points against the current Labour government. And every week in the UK, we have this particular form of theatre called Prime Minister's Questions, where the Prime Minister has to take questions from Parliament, including 6 questions that the Leader of the Opposition gets to ask. And it's probably the most high-profile weekly opportunity for the Leader of Opposition to remind people who they are and that they exist and that they matter.
And it's very entertaining. And I was a Europe, UK and Middle East correspondent for a long time based in London. And I love this as a political nerd, as you would have. But to a lot of people, Prime Minister's Questions is pretty boring.
Correct. But when you can create sort of animation, when you can create these moments of gotcha, as we would think of it from a journalistic point of view, it can kind of go off. And all the opposition benches want is for their leader to land a punch and score points. So I'm looking at transport and I'm like, well, developing new policies is really hard. But you know what we could maybe do is point out where the Labor government's policies have failed. So we didn't use the language of brand much. We had started to talk about the importance of narrative, this idea that people don't vote for you because of your policies. They vote for you because of their feeling that you're going to be on their side. Life brought me very joyously to Australia in 2005, and I sort of left my political career behind and had no real idea what I wanted to do. But I got very lucky. I got a chance to go and work in an agency, and this particular agency was called Jack Morton. It was quite an old American agency, but it wasn't one of the sort of Madison Avenue Mad Men era advertising agencies.
Right.
Instead, it had come out of the world of big events. Jack Morton was one of the originators of what they called business theatre. In fact, his story goes all the way back to putting on events to entertain US troops. One of the first briefs I had was for this comical device. It was called the Nokia N93. And it looked like a 5-year-old child had sort of imagined what would happen if you sort of strapped a camera on top of a phone.
Right.
And Nokia were like, this is I can't even remember what they called it. I think they called it a handheld multimedia device.
Imagine that.
I know, imagine that. And then luckily within our job was to create all these launch events around, not just Australia, but around Asia to launch it. And then luckily within about 6 months, Steve Jobs stood on the stage in California, held up the iPhone.
Actually,
and he was
this
like,
is how we're doing
He's like,
it.
hold my beer.
Yeah.
This is the future and it's an iPhone. And it was a really fascinating time because, you look at 2004, Facebook launched. Most of us didn't get a Facebook account in probably the late 2000s. Yep. I think mine goes back to 2010 and I stopped using it in about 2020, except when I need to look someone up I used to know a long time ago. But, so Facebook was new. YouTube was new. Now we had all these platforms in our pockets. And this was fundamentally changing the ways that brands could engage with their audiences, with consumers. And clearly the sort of effectiveness of television advertising was declining. Audiences were getting fragmented. Soon we were going to contend with a lot of Netflix and Disney Plus and all those things. So the sort of rules, the foundations for how brands get built were being disrupted at speed. And I was sitting in an agency that instead of trying to cling on to the past was going, how can we play in the future?
Yeah.
I was the first head of strategy for Jack Morton in Australia. I then got lucky and got invited to go and move to New York with my creative partner and my managing director. And so the 3 sort of Australians, or me as this Brit converted to an Australian, 3 of us go and take over this New York office, which is just, again, slightly comical. Like, what the hell do you Australians know about this? But how many times in your life do you get to build a giant TV frame in the middle of Times Square?
Extraordinary.
invite the Black Eyed Peas to jump out from it and perform on stage while James Cameron films it in 3D.
So New York.
All of those things we did. Um, whether it was a good idea or not, I don't know, to launch 3D TV. Last I checked, most of us still don't have 3D TVs, but I'm blaming that on the technology, not on the launch event. But yeah, it was this incredible experience and this opportunity to walk in to mourn you. In fact, in that case, it was the middle of the global financial crisis. The reason we got invited to go to New York was the New York office was pretty much in ruins because the bottom had fallen out of Wall Street, the bottom had fallen out of the American economy. A lot of jobs had been lost there. It was a really sad, difficult time, and someone needed to come in and rebuild it, but now rebuild it based on these new marketing conditions. Again, serendipity, opportunity, but also the importance of having an anchoring narrative. You know, and for us, there was this belief that there was an opportunity for brands to be built differently. There was this belief that if the 20th century had been defined by mediocrity sold well, you know, here's a car, it probably doesn't work very well, but we're going to make some really sexy ads that make it look fantastic. And you can just ignore the fact that within 6 months, you're going to be at the side of the road waiting for the NRMA to come pick you up. Shifting into a world of if you disappointed people, well, they could tell the world about it instantly.
Unacceptable.
So this sense of transparency,
and immediacy.
This immediacy, this power that consumers had meant that what was going to matter now was not the story you told, but the story you delivered, how you behaved, how you showed up as a brand, whether it was your product, a physical product, your customer service.
I know the landscape has changed so much since your time at Jack Morton, but building on, you know, some of those key foundational lessons that you were taking on board then, I'm interested, when you sit down to storyboard or workshop with a new brand or business now, what is your approach? Where do you sort of start? What do you strip it back to? Because it seems to me that so many businesses are having identity crises.
100%. And I always come back, every conversation I have with any kind of business, whether it is with a brand new startup, a business that's kind of in its growing up, scaling phase, or a really mature global brand, I always bring it back to the core of their business strategy. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about storytelling, brand building, marketing. All of these things are too important to belong to one department. And the first story I always want to get right for any business is the story of why they exist, why they matter, and how they are going to grow. And I would challenge anyone I meet, and I don't mean this like in an aggressive challenge way, but like, if you can't tell me the story of how your business is going to grow, you do not have a strategy.
Because you don't know it yourself.
Correct. So yes, you can get out a 40 slide PowerPoint deck that was prepared for you by management consultants and sort of wave it around.
And AI.
But if you, well, correct. Well, let's not even go to that.
Whole nother challenge.
Yeah. But if you can't tell me that story simply, I don't think you have a strategy. So with that primary story, you start to then create this understanding of what business are you really in? What are going to be the tools and levers that are going to drive your growth and drive your success? And that then leads you to other realizations, like what contribution do we need brand to make? In other words, if we're going to be that success story, how do we need to make people feel? So it becomes almost like a set of Russian dolls, and you can then get to a particular isolated point. And go, right, well, you're launching a new product. How do we tell the story of that? Or you're trying to sort of, you've got this inflection point and you're shifting the center of gravity of your business a little bit. How do we tell that story? But it always needs to come back to that central understanding of the business you're in. Storytelling does not belong or should not belong to the marketing and communications department. Brand should not belong to the coloring in people who are doing brand design. These are primary decisions about where are you putting your resources, where are you spending your money, what talent are you hiring, how are you going to grow, how are you going to be successful. That is the only story that matters for any business, and often it's a story they haven't got very clear on.
How critical is authenticity in this time when people are really questioning everything that they see and read online? Fake news, misinformation. It's a quagmire out there.
Authenticity matters both at a business level and a human level. We can tell when people are making it up, and we can tell when people are giving us the real stuff, which is why when you're defining the stories that will fuel your success, fundamentally, they've got to be true.
Well, I guess the risk of tying your personal story and your sort of personal brand to a business is as you mentioned, that if people don't like you or they don't believe your story or your credibility, you've got a real problem.
Well, and you've got to decide how much you are willing to show up to be part of that brand. One of the inbuilt advantages of founder-led businesses is the founders are human beings who have the right to talk on their behalf. But to your point, every person has to make a decision. How much am I willing to sort of Venn diagram my personal brand and my personal voice with the voice of this business and this brand that I'm building?
I think consumers appreciate and almost expect that accessibility now because, the program I work on, 60 Minutes, used to be the place you would turn to watch huge Hollywood celebrities. They would just go on these big kind of legacy media programs. And now, sadly, less and less are we needed because they can access their public. They've got their own Instagram accounts. They say what they want to say. They share what they want to share. And similar for CEOs and businesses, I think.
And also, we talk about the platforms. Back in the day, do I trust the ABC? Do I trust 60 Minutes? But now also, do I trust Amelia Adams? We're all sort of on, we're constantly like on trial as brands. And, we saw this at Four Pillars. Like when you have these moments where the credibility of your story is really tested. So, if you fast forward from the founding of Four Pillars in 2013, we're only 5.5 years in, middle of 2019, make sure my maths is right, quick check, yes, I think it is, and we take investment from Lion. Now, this for a lot of people could have been a selling out moment. Small craft Aussie gin brand sells out to brewing giant who themselves are owned by Kirin of Japan. And you're like, okay, well now the paper trail of Four Pillars goes all the way to the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Yeah. How can you still say you are craft? But let's look at some of the things that we did. We never at any stage used the word small to define craft. We never sort of lobbed bricks and grenades at big gym brands. Instead, we always talked about the fact that we wanted to be craft at scale. We talked about craft as an act of quality, a commitment to an ethos, a commitment to attention to detail, to putting product before anything else. We just said that is hard to scale, but back to that notion, that's one of the hard things we choose to do. So we always talked about ambition. We talked about putting Australian gin on the global stage. So when it came to announce to our customers, and we had a pretty big database, that little group of 300 people who crowdfunded our first batch, that had grown to about 30,000 people in our database. So there were 30,000 people who were there for the smallness, there for the intimacy, and we had to send them all an email saying, by the way, we just got 50% acquired by a pretty big global company. But because we were so transparent with it, completely authentic, because we were able to talk about continuity and say, we've always said these are our ambitions, and this is the next natural stepping stone to achieving those ambitions. So whereas so many craft brewers in particular had received so much flack every time they had, inverted commas, sold out, we actually saw almost zero backlash. So if you look at a great business, one of my favorite brands, Aesop, like I think it's one of the great Australian success stories.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't even know it's Australian because it looks so sort of Japanese and it has this sense
brand,
of refinement.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's from the laneways of Melbourne. Started out as a hairdresser's, founded by this visionary called Des Perfitis, and he just sort of saw this opportunity to bring drama and theatre and design and beauty. And so Aesop is built on a theory of the stores are these incredible centres of gravity of like life in an Aesop world just looks better and smells better.
I just love walking in there. I love how it makes
wonderful.
me feel, even if I don't want to buy anything or I can't afford to buy anything.
Correct.
It's
a
an
little
experience.
And it transports you. Now, not every brand could grow that way, but Aesop found a way to celebrate the truth of their product excellence in a way that was authentic to them, in a way that they could sustain, and in a way that motivated their customers.
There's always a new gin brand or a homewares or soap brand, and you must have felt that keenly. There'll always be people entering the market, and even for an iconic brand, and I wonder if you've worked with brands in this situation before. I think about Nike, 10 years ago, and they were just top of the world, and then suddenly Lululemon, it must have just been thinking, how do we get in on some of that? How do we make people, suddenly they have sort of transformed the sporting leisure wear into this incredible, like, everyone's only wearing Lululemon.
I think it's such a good example, right? Because what you're getting at there is that everything is changing all the time. So one of the stories that I really focus on when I'm doing sort of advisory work, but I give a lot of keynotes and I talk about this, is you have to have a story of change. What is changing in the world? What is changing in your category? So what Lululemon saw and took advantage of was this extraordinary shift towards activewear, to this wellness lifestyle, to the fact that, Nike had built around the fascination with running, but not necessarily the fascination with Pilates and yoga and having matcha green tea drinks at Bondi Beach still in your activewear 7 days in a row. So one of the stories of change you need to have is, what does the world need now? And how is that need changing? And how can we address that need? The other side of it is, what's our story of what the world can offer us now? What is the opportunity now? To what extent will the things that got you this far continue to deliver for you? And to what extent do you now need to let go of things so you make room to do new and different things because your business demands it, because the culture requires it, because there's opportunity there? You look at the growth of almost any brand, any business. We go through 3 phases. The first phase is pity. So the pity phase is when you tell your friends, I've decided to make gin. And they all go, oh God, really? But they feel sorry for you. So they're like, oh, send me the website link and I'll buy a bottle. Then you have the early adopt phase. This is where shit gets real, because people who are really invested in that category, like I was thinking, it's the gin drinking equivalents for 4 Pillars of the people who in the early 80s went out and bought a Betamax video recorder before everyone else bought a VHS. It's like the people are like, no, I know the category. Like, I know watches, I know whiskey, I know gin. So they're into it. And don't celebrate too hard when you win them, because they're the people who are unusual. Most gin drinkers buy gin when they run out of gin. They've got 1 bottle of gin at home, and they make that final G&T, and then they add it to the list. And the next time they or their partners at Dan Murphy's, they wander through, and then they look and they see what's on special and what's on promotion and which brands catch their eye, and they buy 1 bottle.
So you have to get that person when they're wandering into the bottle shop, or you have to get someone to recommend 4 Pillars to that person.
Correct. And the point about updating your story is to recognize that the story you told yourself about that early growth, how we're going to win those really engaged customers, is probably not going to work as we go into this next round of scale. So my point being, the moral of the story being, and it's really, really painful to sort of recognize this, that everything is changing all the time. Your competitors, if you dare be successful, your competitors are going to copy you. Just when you think you've got the category figured out, the category changes. So if you have a 5-year plan that didn't include how we're dealing with a world that's going to be shaped by AI, changed by AI.
You can throw that plan out.
Correct.
Constant pivoting. As long as I've known you, Matt, you've had your fingers in a million projects and businesses and advisory boards and all manner of things. And we've covered today everything from military intelligence to politics to global brands. What are you up to now? And I guess really, how are you using all of these lessons, not just from gin, in your work with businesses and CEOs and leaders?
I think I've reached this point in my life where the imposter syndrome that I think we all suffer a bit is starting to fall away to some extent. I got invited 3 years ago to put my hand up to join the City of Sydney's business advisory panel. And then for my sins, I got elected chair. So I've sort of spent the last 3 years co-chairing and then chairing the panel. And this is a group of sort of really serious grown-up people from business and education and property and investment, advising the City of Sydney on the growth of its economy. And although it is only the city, it is the single most important economic hub in Australia.
Absolutely.
And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Am I going all the way back to the start of my career as this pretty crappy economist? But it turned out that what I was able to do as the chair of the panel was help us think about what is the story of how Sydney is going to grow? What is the story of the Sydney we want to live in, the contribution the economy is going to make to that, but also the ways that this economy can grow, the roles of our places, our neighborhoods, the role of experience, the role of investment, the role of education. And I had yet another moment where I'm like, this whole game is storytelling. And that's what I enjoy doing, helping people see that little hack, that little cheat code, that little thing that actually isn't a hack, isn't a cheat code, because it's hard. It's hard to do well. It's easy to tell a bad story. It's hard to tell a good one. It's hard to tell a good one consistently in the right ways to the right people at the right time. But if you can craft that and define it and tell it and do it and deliver on it, I think it can be an incredibly powerful contributor to success in life, in business, in politics. So if I'm helping people do that stuff in some way, that feels rewarding. Feels good.
Well, from someone who has been telling stories for a living for more than 20 years, I think you do a pretty extraordinary job. This podcast will feature many more influential and successful humans and stories. But it's been a pleasure to be here and share yours, which is truly unique and pretty remarkable story.
Thank you for joining me, and thank you for coaching me on what a professional interviewer looks like, and wish me luck.
Good luck.
On the rest of this series.
Can't wait to watch and listen.
Thanks, Billy. Storywork was brought to you in partnership with Slingshot. As you've heard in today's episode, stories really matter, and there is no story more important than the one you tell your customers. But finding the right time, place, channel, and medium through which to tell that story is critical, and that's where my great friends at Slingshot come in. Slingshot pride themselves on developing creative media strategies to propel their clients further, faster. You can find out more about the brilliant work that Slingshot does, helping brands find their audiences, tell their stories, and achieve their objectives at slingshot.com.au. And talking about finding out more, you can find out more about this and every episode of Storywork, including all the show notes and all of my key learnings from every conversation over on Substack.